when I say names, I'm really talking about people. So 2 apologies to start with. I will be mentioning men and women who died, and they may be relations or family friends. And this is, of course, totally unintentional. So my apology if it catches you the wrong way. We're all mature enough to overlook the wet eyes sitting near us, although with Zoom, I realize that many of you are sitting alone. And secondly, in the past 20 years, I've grown more interested in the dead than in those who have survived. And I realized this the other day when I was talking with a lady about her great uncle's war service. And I finally asked, did he come home? Yes, she answered. Oh dear, I said, and I really didn't mean it that way at all. Next slide, please. So in 1921, Kingston dedicated a hall within its city hall as Memorial Hall with 12 war-related and commercially sponsored stained glass windows and a plaque with 258 names of those who died in service during the Great War. Those names collected from plaques around the city. And Frontenac County also unveiled a memorial with 125 names, and 2 names are on both. Next slide, please. After the Second World War, the City of Kingston built Memorial Arena, dedicated to the Kingston war dead, but no names were added. The plaque was later amended to include the Korean War deaths, but there had been no commemoration for those who died in later United Nations activities. So by 2000, few connected Memorial Arena with the war. And so in 2005, the city decided to improve the park that the arena sat in and to include a memorial garden and a commemorative wall. And I was asked by the City of Kingston to gather the names to go on the memorial wall because I'd been researching the topic for the previous 10 years. Next slide, please. And this talk will try to answer the oft-asked question, where did you find the names? But really the question should be, why were those names not known in the first place? Next slide. Remembering individual soldiers is a new phenomenon. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, some 40,000 men and 10,000 horses were lying dead or injured on the battlefield. The armies left them for the looters, the sightseers, and the local peasants who stripped the living and the dead of their clothing and took anything else that seemed to be of use. Finally, next morning, medical help arrived. The dead horses were burned and the human bodies thrown into unmarked mass graves. There was no thought of commemoration for the ordinary soldier, and their families would not be informed of their deaths. Next slide, please. Commemoration of the ordinary soldier seems to have started in the United Kingdom at about the time of the Crimean War, around 1855. And you will know that some of those battles are commemorated in Kingston street names. Alma Street and Redan Street and Balaclava, where Lord Raglan fought. And Kingston heard about the charge of the Light Brigade along with the work of Nurse Florence Nightingale. And why? Well, because for the first time, the war was reported on by newspapers, and especially William Russell telegraphed his daily reports for publication in the London Times. And cameras recorded a war. People knew what was happening. Next slide, please. There'd always been commemorations of individual soldiers who were not officers. There was some commemoration of individual soldiers who were not officers. Officers had always been remembered in death. And here on the right, the Sowerby Memorial even does not include ranks. Next slide, please. And records of the dead are started, and monuments to individual soldiers appear, and 10 years later, military cemeteries such as Gettysburg and Arlington are started. Next slide. And when Canada had its first war deaths in the 1885 Northwest Rebellion, marked graves were created for the Northwest Mounted Police who died, and the original markers became part of the new standard markers. Next slide, please. When Queen Victoria learned what had happened to her dead soldiers, she demanded better treatment for the dead. And in 1889, the mass graves around Waterloo were consolidated into one grave in a Brussels cemetery with a marker mentioning officers and men, and a sculpture. With the South African War in 1900, we find honor rolls of those who served and formal graves paid for and still maintained, I believe, by the IODE. And if we had the picture here, you would see on the right the first person on our memorial wall, Edward Allen Filson, who lived in Stella on Amherst Island. And there is, I believe, still an annual service on, it would have been last Sunday, the Sunday before Remembrance Day. That's Queen Victoria's monument. So if you go on to the next slide, there is Filson down in the right-hand corner, and you begin to see individual soldiers' graves. And then we can go on to the next slide. All of this would change surprisingly quickly in 1914, when the British found itself with a problem. In the first 4 months of retreating in 1914, the British suffered 50,000 dead. And recording your dead is difficult when you're in retreat. But as is so often the case, the right person was in the right place at the right time. Fabian Ware, deemed too old at 45 for military service, instead became the commander of a Red Cross mobile ambulance unit in France. He persuaded the Red Cross to pay for durable grave markers, and he began actively searching the battlefields to retrieve the dead and to persuade the British authorities to buy land to be used as cemeteries. Within a year, there were 200 sites. And his unit will become the Imperial War Graves Commission, which would standardize the recording procedure. Next slide. So in 1916, Kingston City Council decided to recognize the names of all who had served, but they found that there was no record of who had enlisted. And at the end of the war, various institutions created lists of their members who had served. And here we see some of those, but notice the variety of forms. There's a commercially bought template that Bethel Church used. There's ordinary white paper, handwritten, Sydenham Methodist. There's a formal plaque, but notice that this is Mowat. Mowat had been mayor in 1905. There's absolutely no mention of him as mayor. He's simply as a person. Down here, Scotty Davidson. Scotty Davidson scored the winning goal, the Stanley Cup final, 1913 for Toronto. The last time that it was played before the war. He was killed in 1916, but there it's just one of those who died. George Richardson is on this plaque in Sydenham, what is now Sydenham United. He's also up here. Huge donor to the city.
Richardson Wharf?
Yes, Richardson Wharf would be the family as well. Give you another talk on that one day.
Okay.
Next slide, please. So in 1921, Kingston, as I mentioned, dedicated Memorial Hall. The city ignored the far more prosaic types of memorials suggested, like an Arch of Triumph, a comfort station, a granite shaft in Market Square, a bridge to Cedar Island, and the one I like, extending Sydenham Street from Brock to Princess. Instead, they chose to go this way. Next slide, please.
Who was on council back then?
And Frontenac County also unveiled its memorial, but these memorials were bound to be inaccurate for a number of reasons. It was not until 1922 that the IWGC stated who would be classified as war dead. The person had to have died between August the 4th, 1914 and August the 31st, 1921, in service or as a result of injury or illness caused during that service. So now we actually have a standard to work from. Next slide, please. During World War II, the Canadian government commissioned a standard memorial scroll designed by a group of 7-member A.J. Casson. You see his name there, and it appears down in the bottom corner. And I bet you thousands of people have looked at these scrolls and never seen A.J. Casson's name on there. That's right. They came in a number of sizes, and they came in used in a number of different ways. So here, First Baptist Church takes one for its First World War dead, and a second one for its Second World War dead. This is Alcan, by the way, the huge number of people who served. And the Regiopolis again uses World War I up here, World War II down there, and we'll come back to Regiopolis later on. Next slide, please. In 1946, Kingston had already commissioned a book of remembrance. This is 2 years before the formal death time ended. Next slide. For those who served, going to go quickly here, got to stay awake. And next. And for a section for those who died, and next. And again, errors were made. And that book is a locked bookcase in Memorial Hall ever since. It's quite a challenge to get to it. So these are the memorials and sources from which I started. So we then developed a list of criteria for our memorial wall. We excluded those who'd only been here for Queen's or RMC because both of those institutions have their own quite complete memorials. We included, and this will all be on the screen in a moment, I'm sure, we included,
You never know.
no pressure at all, men and women who called Kingston an area their home through birth or residence or school or work, and either died in service in World War I or World War II and are commemorated by the CWGC or in the Ottawa Books of Remembrance, or died in service in the South African War, and then we extended the Korean conflict, almost there, the Middle East missions, and oh, there we go, and we're down somewhere down about here now. And who died in service and commemorate, or who died in service, or were civilians who died in war-related activities during World War I and World War II. And there are actually one person from World War I and 2 civilians from World War II in Kingston. All I now had to do was to see if any names had been omitted from the 2 plaques and the book. And since I'd read all of the plaques I knew about and the 3 newspapers from World War I, the next job was to read the newspapers just the week for World War II. And the papers and institutions also published cumulative lists of deaths, though these are often also inaccurate. Next slide, please. So the first death we find, 1939, is of William Bruce on the Causeway. And when I find news of a previously unknown death, I check on the Commonwealth War Graves website. So if we go to the next slide, which includes, and this is, which includes all British and Commonwealth deaths in both wars and British civilian deaths in World War II. So you're going to click on search, and a drop-down menu lets you choose war dead, cemeteries, and monuments. Next slide. And so we will choose, I'm looking at this from the side, and I think that's the war dead one. We click on that. And I enter as much information as I can along here about William Bruce. Next slide. And find out, and I have to come and look at this one again, sorry. Yeah, so I enter his name, his RCHA, and then he's Canadian Army. Next slide. And it tells me there's no results. And this, those of you who use the web a lot will know that if you don't get it exact, okay, you know that bit. You also know about scrolling, you know, there's nothing on that screen as to what to do next, so you scroll down. So I can do a little bit of guessing here, and if we can go on to the next slide, we find, of course, that his real name, and that's how he's entered, and if you enter anything but that, you won't find him. But there he is. We find him, we find his place of burial. Why this is difficult looking from the side. There we go, place of burial. And if you go on to the next slide, we will also find his parents. So that's the basic information. We knew he was connected with Kingston because he died here. There are problems though. The next slide, I use my father's entry as an example because it's got 2 interesting errors in it. There's the basic information about the service, and down the bottom, you find now where he's from. You find his the address, which for me would tell that they were connected with the Kingston area. And you have to know the area. You have to know where all the little villages are as well. With this entry, I also know who the parents are and the proper name of the widow, all of which can help. And in his case, that there's a professional accreditation, and that can help you find out a lot more about the person. Often a university degree is included there. And if it's a place like Queen's, Queen's has an enormous amount of information on all of their war dead. And a number of universities do that as well. But there is an incorrect address. Sanderstead was not in London. It is now, interestingly enough, but it wasn't at the time.
No.
So you can get totally confused, which, you know, I see smiles. I understand others of you have tried these sorts of games as well. So the information is only as good as the accuracy of the next of kin, who, remember, was in a pretty emotional state when they had to provide all this information. This would have been done probably in 1947, 1948. So could be up to 5 or up to less than 2 years after the death. In our case, we'd moved into London, which is why that error occurs. You've got the right village, you've got the wrong town that you're in. But more often than not, we can find the person who we've just discovered. And if they're on that website, then they automatically come into Memorial Wall. Next slide, please. But it's not always as easy. Louis Brown. Next slide. Here's Regiopolis. And as I say, World War I's at the top, World War II's at the bottom. And very poor scroll. Apologies to any Regi grads here. The World War I list was created in about 1937. And those of you who try to think back 20 years know how inaccurate that's likely to be. But Louis Brown is noted as a death. The only problem is I can find absolutely nothing about him. Next slide. And then there he is in the wig. So there really was a Louis Brown. And we now know he's in the Air Force. And I had an approximate date to work on. And, you know, I could still find nothing about him at all. So I sent a letter to the Renfrew newspaper. Renfrew was mentioned in there. And very quickly got a reply, an interested editor, and then a letter from somebody, one of his friends. Next slide, please. Which said, and I don't think the person knew the importance of the information, lost on patrol over the North Sea. So now we know there will not be a grave. We know, next slide, that he'll be commemorated on the Runnymede Memorial for those for whom there is no known grave in the air services. And we're down to mere 20,000 people to choose from. And it's Brown, remember. Next slide. So again, we choose, this time I choose Runnymede, and I'm told doesn't exist. How about Runnymede Memorial? Picky, picky. And the next slide, we find Walter Louis Brown. Date fits roughly according to the newspaper. So I presume we've got him. And then when we go on to more details on the next slide, this is golden. Look at the family names. We have Walter as his father and Eulalia as his mother. Now, how many of you know a Eulalia?
No.
So, you know, this is just treasure when you find out a name like this, because you know you've got it right. There's a much longer story on this one, which I won't have time to tell you today. So we've got the right person, son of Walter, and of course he wasn't called Walter because it was confusing with his name. His dad was a doctor, and he was always Dr. Walter, and so he became Louis. Next slide, please. Nobody in Renfrew ever knew him as Louis. Here he is at Regiopolis. Finally, he was only there for a year. There he is, and there he is on the rugby team.
Number 8, senior rugby.
Yeah, senior rugby team. I don't know where that was taken, but there he is, and I happen to have the yearbooks for the year that he was there. And the next slide shows his wife and him in his RAF outfit. And the next slide. So why was there no record kept at the time? Well, firstly, there were no computers. Everything was done by hand. When a person volunteered, it was conscripted. The first thing they had to complete and sign was the attestation paper here. And one copy was sent to Ottawa, and a file for that person was started. This is the 1914 version of the form, and you'll see what's missing. In all of these, I enlarged a little bit. It doesn't say what's your address. Why does the army want to know your address? You're with them now. They know where you are. And that is one of the most vital pieces that is missed here. I put arrows on here. I'm going to walk into the lyrics so we get the right ones. Address of the next of kin. Well, that's fine, but you may well not be living at home. Date of birth. A lot of people didn't know their dates of birth. You know, you didn't have birth certificates and driver's licenses and things like that. Are you married? Very important. You could not sign up if you were married without a letter from your wife.
Oh,
Nice.
Those two, by the way, were lied about all the time. If you wanted to get away from home and you were married and you were underage, oh, I'm 19 years old. Yeah, no, I'm not married. Do you want to, are you willing to be vaccinated? I thought I'd put that one in just to remind us there. But that is a lot of incorrect, unreliable information that goes there. As well, and another problem on the next slide, this is John Babcock. John Babcock lived locally. He was the last survivor, as you'll probably remember, of the people who served Canada in the First World War. It's 109, I think, when he died. That's where he comes from.
first row.
No, Lober Township. Well, I mean, we're out in the country. We've got somebody up from the city. Where are you from? Oh, now what do we say? Is it Loughborough? Is it Loughborough? Is it some other? If you live up that way, you know there are 10 ways of saying that name. So this case, it's Lober. And unless you know that, you're not going to find it. And certainly, admittedly, you cannot search these documents, but if you could, you still wouldn't find very much out at all. Next one shows some more difficulties. Yeah, this is McPherson, M-A-C, see his signature, M-A-C-P-H-E-R-S-O-N. So what do we have up here? M-C. What do we have for his next of kin? M-C. What do we have typing that he signed? M-C. And what do you have on his grave? M-C. There was absolutely nothing wrong in respelling your name M-A-C or M-C or M apostrophe. They all appear, and as you can see, they're totally acceptable. It's not so easy tracking people down in later years. People would change their names. If you were Fred and you went into the office and there were 2 Freds there already, the chances are you'd be told to come up with a different name. If you were Aloysius, thank goodness you could finally change your name from that awful thing your mother gave you, and you could become Fred or whatever else it was. There were immigrants from Central Europe who were in a difficult situation because they wanted to fight against their native country. Many of them went home and fought on the other side, but many stayed and fought with Canada. On the next slide, you'll see one of these difficulties. Huntback brothers. Well, Huntback, obviously, this is a German spelling or a Middle European spelling. Well, that looks pretty easy. If you had time to read it through, you'd see that the two of them are dead. Charles and Ernest have both died, leaving 2 brothers in Battersea, and Charles also left his wife of 6 weeks. The facts: the boys enlisted with the Western Battalion, where they were residing when the war started. About a year after I found this, no, they were in Winnipeg. Ernest signed up with the Princess Patricia's, and who else do we have? We've got the 4 brothers, and I'm going to get them muddled up. Charles, not a trace of Charles. Next slide. Ernest had said he was born in England, and the chances then are that his brother had gone back to England. A lot of people did this. They did not want to fight with these new people they were living with here. They wanted to go back because the British kept you in small groups. If you lived in Manchester, chances are you were fighting with a whole group of Manchester people. So we go to the CWC website on this one. And yes, we find that he was with the 17th Manchester Regiment, the 2nd Manchester Pals, and he died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. in one of the very few successful British engagements on that day of 19,000 fatal casualties. And oh, we're on the next slide already, very good. I found somehow that there was in fact a memorial here for one of them in Battersea United Church. Ernest misspelled, but the Germanic form of the name. I also found and I forget how I did this, it was a ridiculous trip, little village in England. There's Ernest on the school, on the village war memorial. This time we've got Ernest spelled properly, but now we've got anglicized P-A-C-K, and his brother, whose body was never found, is on the Theatral Memorial, and again, B-A-C-K. So you can see how difficult it comes to be. Finally, I was in touch with a relative of these, and I forget how that happened. And he said, yep, the four brothers were orphaned in England. They were all sent out here to work on the farm up in Frontenac County and on one of the resettlement schemes. And the two older ones both signed up and died in the war. So, got 3 to go. Then you can tell me it's time.
Doing a good job, Peter.
Oh, the clock stopped anyway. Next slide. So, the wall has been an interesting success. The city at first thought it would become where the city's remembrance service will be held with its indoor facility in poor weather. That idea was quickly shot down by the service groups who did not want to move from the Lakeside Memorial and laughed at the need to go indoors, but also pointed out that it was a much longer march that they would have to do. But it is visited by those remembering and by school groups. A couple of times I've been there on the 11th of November when it's been a school day. Groups have gone, small classes have gone, taken a tape recorder with the anthem and so on and so forth. Next slide. The spaces have been used for placing poppies, and that of course started with the Vietnam War in Washington. We never thought of that, I don't think, but it hadn't been up. Well, it was opened in late October in 2012, and so that first Remembrance Day, the poppies appeared, and they've appeared ever since. And it's certainly seen by more people than Memorial Hall or the Cross of Sacrifice on the waterfront. And the last slide. So, as I said at the start, this is about people remembered, and all concerned with the project are gratified that on Remembrance Day, the wall is visited and people show that they still do remember individuals. And if you know of anybody who has been inadvertently omitted, and I really mean inadvertently, please contact me or the city. So, thank you very much.